Hi everyone, in this video I want to show you a game between Grandmaster Parligras Mircea-Emilian from Romania and Grandmaster Sergey Karjakin from Russia. This game was played in Isle of Man International Round 6. Let's analyze the game from the point of view of opening, middle game and end game. It was a long and very instructive game where Mircea outplayed his opponent in the middle game, but in the end game Kariakin proved to be better. White started with d4, knight to f6, c4, e6, allowing the dark square bishop to enter the game, knight to c3 and bishop to b4. And with this move we have the Nimzo-Indian defense. In this position white can go for several options with e3, queen to c2, knight to f3, f3, bishop to g5, a3, bishop to d2, g3, queen to b3 and bishop to f4. From all these options, Mircea went for the classical line with queen to c2, d5 attacking the center. Another way for black was to castle a3, black took, white recaptured with the queen and knight to e4, moving the same piece in an opening, attacking the queen. Better was to continue the development with short castle, queen to c2, c5, attacking one more time, white center and white took on c5. And black can recover this pawn with queen to a5, check and pick up the pawn. Knight to c6, developing another piece, and white does the same with knight to f3, queen to a5 check, bishop to d2 blocking, and white takes the pawn, threatening to give a check on f2. e3 defending against this threat, allowing the light square bishop to enter the game. Black took on d2, white recaptured, d takes on c4. Usually the tension should be maintained unless it gives a concrete advantage. In this case, black helped white to bring his bishop into the game by taking the pawn. Black king is safe. Before attacking the queen, another way was to castle and finish the opening. Queen to e7, short castle. At this point, white finishes opening, his king is safe, rooks are connected and all other pieces are developed. Now we enter the middle game, and in this phase of the game we should start attacking opponent weaknesses, which are weak squares and weak pawns. But in this position black only has a weak square on d6. So if attacking moves are not working, white should try to activate his least active pieces and try to provoke some weaknesses in opponent camp. Looking at white pieces, his queen stands well on this position, the rooks can go on the c and d files. The light square bishop looks at the wall of pawn, so it can be rerouted to b1 h7 diagonal or to h1 a8 diagonal via e2 and f3. The knight can go to c4, looking to jump on d6. Let's see what happened in the game. Black continued with rook to d8. Better was to finish the opening with bishop to d7. White continued with bishop to d3 and h6. The pawn was attacked twice. Next, white should bring his rooks to the open files, but in the game he improved the activity of his bishop even more by putting it to e4. The bishop can take on c6, creating two isolated pawns. Black continued with rook to b8, and if white takes on c6, he cannot recapture the pawn because the knight is hanging. So knight to c4 was played, and after white takes on e6, white can play knight to a5, attacking this pawn. In the game, a6 was played, creating a weak square on b6, and white took on c6, b takes. White middle plan of attacking and placing his pieces on better squares was successful. He created two isolated pawns on c6 and a6. Since we have a change in pawn structure, we need to update our plan. White has two new targets to attack. He needs to bring his pieces into the game to help him into the attack. And for this, the rooks will come on the c and d files. The knight can come to a5, threatening a deadly fork on c6. In the game, white did this with knight to a5, bishop to b7, defending the pawn, and we can notice that the bishop has the role of a simple pawn. Looking at this position, white has no good attacking moves, so he needs to activate his rooks, and he played rook a to c1, rook to d6, defending the pawn one more time, preparing to double on the d-file, and white brings his other rook to d-file, rook b to d8. In the game, white continue with h3, a good prophylactic move, discarding any potential mate threat on the first line. Bishop to a8. In any position, you have to ask yourself what is the drawback of my opponent's last move, and the problem with this move is that a6 remains unprotected. Mircea spotted this and he attacked this pawn with his queen after he took first on d6, played queen to e2, attacking the pawn, queen to d8. Black did not defend his pawn and white can grab it. In the game, he played knight to b3, controlling d2 square. Black was threatening to play a rook to d2, attacking the queen. White continued with bishop to b7, and white needs to continue his attack of a6 and c6 pawns. And the last one is the most accessible for attack, and for this he needs to remove one of his defenders. White needs to push his pieces forward in order to attack black and make it to go back. For this he played e4, intending e5, but black stopped this by playing e5 himself, and we can see that this pawn is unprotected, and white can attack it in two moves with knight to a5 attacking the bishop and then knight to c4 attacking the rook and the pawn. So we had knight to a5, bishop to a8. This is a move back. Another way for black was to counter attack white rook with queen to g5 and then put the bishop back, knight to c4. Black rook cannot go to e6 because white will take the d-file with rook to d1. Instead, rook to d4 was played and white won a pawn with knight takes on e5. Here we can notice that white has a pawn majority on the king side. Also, a6 pawn is free to take. Black continue with c5, activating his bishop, attacking e4 pawn for a second time. White took the pawn from c5, bishop takes on e4. If black would have taken with the rook, white can take on a6 and then threaten rook to c8, capturing black queen. But we had bishop to e4, white took another pawn, and in this position his two pawns up, and these pawns are connected and passed. So he is winning in this position. In this endgame position, the plan is different. For us, we need to push our passed pawns, and regarding our opponent, we need to attack his weak pawns. For the moment, black has no weak pawns, so white plan is simple, to push his pawns. Of course, white has to pay attention to black threats, but when black has no threat, white needs to push his pawns. So white needs to focus his entire energy of pushing these passed pawns. Let's see the game continuations, where black played rook to d1, check, king to h2, queen to d2, threatening to give a check on f4. White prevented this with queen to c8 and queen to g4, defending f4 square. So we had check, king to a7, into g4. White continued with queen to e1, threatening to check on g2 or h1. And then after the king moves, white will take the pawn. For example, let's play a random move for white, rook to c7. After queen to h1 and king to g3, we have queen takes on g2 check, king to h4, queen takes on f2 check, king to h5, g6 check, and white has to give material with knight takes, rook to d5 check, knight to e5, rook takes, and its mate. In the game, white found the best move with knight to f3, attacking the queen, interposing between the bishop and the pawn. Black give a check on h1, king to g3, and the king is safe on this square. Black continue with bishop to g6. The bishop was under attacked by the queen. Another way was to play f5, defending the bishop and attacking the queen. In this position, black has no attack, so white should push his passed pawns with a4 and b5. Instead, white brought his rook back to c3. This is a mistake. Rook to d8. Black retreated voluntarily on the last rank, and white can push again his pawns forward. But white didn't do this and play queen to f4. Let's see what would happen if white would have pushed b5. Queen to e1, attacking the pawn. Queen to c4, defending. Rook to e8, intending. Rook to e4, attacking the queen. a4, rook to e4, queen to b3, rook to b4, queens are exchanged, and rook to e3, getting behind the pass pawn. After bishop to c2, attacking a4 for a second time. White can push this pawn, and if black takes on b5, the knight jumps to d4, forking the rook and the bishop, but we have a check first. King to f3, bishop to g6, a6. Black cannot stop this pawn. White pins the bishop, and even if black tries to defend the bishop, white is promoting the next move. In the game, queen to f4 was played, tending to trap black queen with rook to c1, queen to a1, queen to c1, trying to exchange queens, queen to a2, queen to e3, rook to d6. Maybe black will attack white queen with rook to e6. White has a free time to push his b pawn forward, and he finally did it. b5, rook to e6, queen to c5, going forward, helping his pawn to reach b6, bishop to e4, attacking the knight and freeing g6 square for the rook to come and give a check. King to h2, white moved the king away, not allowing black any counter chance. Pushing the pawn to b6 is not good. Usually connected pawns should stay together. White needs to push a4 first. Black continue with rook to g6, looking at g2 pawn. Black queen can go on the first line, then come to f1, deliver mate on g2. Queen to d4, centralizing the queen, attacking the bishop, preparing a4, queen to b1, defending the bishop, attacking b5, threatening to go on f1. In this position, white first thought should be to push his pawns. Looking closely, this is possible because after queen to f1, white can give a check with the knight on g5, and white can pick up the bishop, protecting g2 pawn. Instead, white played queen to c4. The queen looks at f1 square, and also she's looking at f7 pawn, which is unprotected. White cannot take on f7 because b5 is unprotected. In the game, black continue with bishop to b7. This is a move back. White cannot push a4 now because black attacks f2 pawn with queen to b2, and if white attacks the queen, black can win a piece with bishop takes on f3, and if white captures the queen, black delivers a check on g2, king to h1, rook to g4, check from the bishop, picking up the queen, and black is a piece up in that position, but white has to connect it past pawns, so black can draw that position. White continued with queen takes on f7, and the drawback of this move is that white is losing his b5 pawn. As I said before, in an endgame, two connected pass pawns gives you a winning advantage, and you should do everything that stands in your power to push them and not lose them. So black took the pawn, rook to b3, double attacking the queen and the bishop, but black replies with queen to f1, threatening mate. And here white made a little combination with knight to g5 check, rook takes, and queen takes on b7, recovering the piece and defending g2 pawn. Black took on f2, and white has only one passed pawn, so his advantage is gone. Now we can see why two connected pass pawns are much stronger than one pass pawn. White continue with queen to e4, queen to a5, queens are exchanged, white is pushing the pawn, black stops the pawn, and white cannot progress in this position. Rook to a3, defending, and for a couple of moves, both kings come into the center. If white king comes to attack black rook, black king will get there in time, and if white tries to attack black pawns from the king side, the rook can defend them easily. So we had king to g6, king to g3, king to f5, king to f3, h5, controlling g4, bringing the pawns closer to white camp, king to e3, king to e5, king to d3, king to d5, king to c5, rook to a2, defending the g2 pawn, king to b6, king to d4, king to c6, king to c4. So we have some king dancing here. The rook is looking at a g2 pawn, a5 check, king to a6, and white king cannot do anything to push his passed pawn. So the king moves away, h4, and white king now tries to come and grab this pawn. King to d4, rook to b5, king to e4, g5 defending, king to f3, rook to b4, rook to d2, and black cannot take due to rook to d5. And if black pulls the rook, he will take it and white will pick up the pawns. And if the king moves, then the rook will take the pawn. So rook to f4 check, king to e3, rook to f5, attacking the pawn, rook to a2 defending, rook to b5, and the same thing, black cannot take on a5, king to e4, rook to c5, rook to f2, rook takes, rook to f5, trying to exchange rooks, but black doesn't want to do this because he's losing. Rook to a4 check, king to f3, rook to a3, king to g4, rook to g3 check, king to h5, rook takes, and the same thing, black cannot exchange the rooks. Rook to h2, king takes on h4, king to b6, rook to d5, trying to stop the king to advance on the king side. King to c6, and here we had another critical moment of this game where white could have won this by playing rook to d4. In the game, rook to d3 was played. If rook to d4 would have been played, black has two options here: to move the rook and try to come and give checks to white king, or attack the rook with the king. Let's see the first one. For example, with rook to c2, king to h5, white wants to push the pawn, king to c5 attacking the rook, rook to d3, king to c4, rook to d8, the king cannot go on the king side, king to b5, rook to f8, rook to h2, h4, king to c6, coming for the rook, rook to d8, the rook doesn't let the king to come, king to c7, rook to d1, rook to g2, king to h6, rook to h2, h5. Slowly but surely white is pushing the pawn, rook to h3, rook to g1, avoiding any checks from black on the g file. The king will go to g6 and the pawn will push. King to d6, king to g6, king to e6, h6, rook to f3, h7. Black cannot stop this pawn. Have a check, another check, and rook to g8, rook to f1. White will play rook to f8 if black plays rook to c8 check, and indeed we can have a check, rook to f8, and white is promoting the pawn. Let's see the other line where black attacks the rook with the king, and here the rook can go to d8, rook to e2, king to g5, rook to e5 check, king to f4, attacking the rook, rook to a6, and white can push the pawn. Black wants to exchange rooks, but for the moment it's not possible. We have check, king to d5, king to f5, rook to d7, h5, rook to f7, king to g6, king to e6, rook to e8 check, and now white can exchange rooks because his pawn is promoting. Black king cannot come to g8. White is winning as well. So in the game we had rook to d3. Now black rook can come and check white king, and white cannot push this pawn anymore. So after rook to d3 we had rook to a2, king to g5, rook to a5 check, king to g4. If the king tries to go forward, black rook will come to a4, preventing the pawn to move forward. Rook to a4 check, king to g5, rook to a5. White tries this to go forward, but rook to a4 preventing the pawn to push. King to f6, king to c7, king to g5, rook to a5 check, king to g4, rook to a4, king to g3. White cannot progress in this position. Rook to a4, h4, rook to d8, rooks are exchanged, and players agreed to a draw. So this was the game between Grandmaster Parligras Mircea-Emilian from Romania and Grandmaster Sergey Karjakin from Russia. I hope you found this video useful. Please watch other games from my channel and leave some comments and suggestions in the comment section. See you next time. Bye.